Hey everybody, welcome to the video. Let's go over the 13-game MLB DFS slate for today on DraftKings. But before we continue, as always, if you guys could just leave a like. I know it's something as small as just leaving a like on a video, but it really does help me out, and I really do appreciate it. And if you're new to the channel, you might as well hit that subscribe button. I'm going to be here all season long trying to help you guys become better MLB DFS players. And I cover the sports as well. So if you're going to keep coming back to the channel each and every single day or each and every single week, you might as well hit that subscribe button, turn the notification bell so you don't miss out whenever I post new content. You can also follow me on social media. I'm at ChrisPennell16 on Twitter, CPenn16 on IG. And if you want more content over on Patreon, obviously much appreciated. We got over 300 people there. You can hop into the Discord chat, ask me questions all day, and just get access to all the spreadsheets that I put out every single day, the top stacks, the cheat sheets, and all that fun stuff. And I do other sports as well, like NASCAR, and I do articles for that too. So if you're interested, links in the description below. If you're not, that's fine. Let's just dive into today's slate. So this slate is pretty loaded. I mean, we got a lot of good pitching options. We got a good spend-up option in Garrett Cole. You even have Jacob deGrom, but I'm not really too on deGrom today. But I like Garrett Cole up top, and then we have plenty of good 9 and 8K range options. 7K is not that great, but Kyle Wright's viable at 6,500 going against Miami, so we'll talk about that if you just want to fit in some, big boppers in your lineup like some Charlie Blackmons and Arenados of the world. But overall, pretty loaded slate. Also, the offenses, we have a Coors Field slate today, so that's always something to keep in mind. But I don't think they're an absolute must because we have some other good offenses as well. Just off the top of my head, I know Cleveland's in a pretty good spot, and also Cincy lefties are in a good spot versus Chad Kuhl. So pretty loaded slate, and I'm looking forward to it. So let's just dive into it. So up top, we have the ace of the slate, Garrett Cole. He comes in at 11,000. Super expensive going up against Boston. Now, Boston does have some good, bats in the lineup. You got JD Martinez, Xander Bogaerts, even Mitch Moreland versus right-handed pitching. Christian Vasquez, which I guess isn't the greatest guy in the world, but you also have Alex Verdugo. So it's not the worst lineup in the world, but Boston just has not been that great this season, and they're going up against Garrett Cole, and Garrett Cole can pretty much take on any single offense he faces. So don't really care about the matchup so much for Garrett Cole. I just care about his numbers and how much he dominates, and so far this season, he has been fine. Now, I will say he's not striking out guys like he did with the Astros last year, but still good numbers overall, and we'd have to expect those strikeouts are going to pick up. And pitch count is no such thing for Garrett Cole. He's thrown up to 107 pitches and 102 pitches so far, and starts number 2 and number 4. In his numbers this season, he scored 24, 23, 19, and 20 fantasy points. He's one of the safest options you can find. Now, the problem is he's expensive, and there's a lot of good expensive bats on the slate, so I'm not sure if he's a must. But if you're spending up and you have the salary for it, I think he's a totally fine option. Just keep in mind price is an issue, and you don't want to limit yourself with the bats that we have today. But Vegas, there's no implied team total out yet, but I'd have to imagine Boston's going to have one of the lowest, if not the lowest. Might be hard to beat Frankie Montas at 3.39, but still 8.5 strikeouts in Vegas. And if you're looking at his numbers last season, even though the strikeouts are down currently, he still had a 40% K rate last year and a 2.48 xFIP. Good versus lefties and righties, and I think Garrett Cole is a fine option here. He should be able to navigate his way through that Boston lineup. And then looking down, we have Sonny Gray at 9,600, and so Anthony DeSclafani in this same spot just got absolutely nuked yesterday. I think he finished the game with negative 19 points, negative 18. So I ended up going Jake Arrieta as my SP2, thankfully, because he outscored by 25. Arrieta only scored 5 points, which sucks, but he still outscored DeSclafani by 25. Now, I like DeSclafani yesterday. I thought he was a fine option. He was about 50% in cash, so I'm not making fun of the play. I thought he was totally fine. I just happened to go with Arrieta because I needed a couple of extra bucks to fit in, I think, Bryce Harper. So not making fun of it, but man, he just got absolutely smashed. My goodness, I believe he gave up 9 runs in 2 innings. I mean, I know he struggles with lefties sometimes, but he just got absolutely demolished. But Sonny Gray is a much better pitcher than Anthony DeSclafani. I mean, Sonny Gray's got ace-level stuff, and if you're looking at his numbers this season, he's been pretty good. In pitch counts, no issue. He's thrown over 100 pitches in his last 2 starts. Strikeout numbers have been 9, 11, 8, 7, and if you're looking at his fantasy point totals, 30, 39, 27, and 12. So I think he's going to be fine here. Pittsburgh does not strike out a lot versus right-handed pitching whatsoever. Last season, it was below 20%. But Sonny Gray's got some good stuff. He's got a near 30% K rate. He's looked excellent this season. Not a great pitcher's park, but only 3.54 runs against him, which I believe is the second lowest on the slate. 65% chance for the win and 6.5 strikeouts in Vegas. So I do like Sonny Gray here. He does limit the power. And if you're just looking at the splits for Pittsburgh versus righties, there's just not a lot of power here. Only a 168 ISO, 99 WRC plus, 18.9% strikeout rate. But I mean, Sonny Gray's a really good pitcher, and if you don't want to spend all the way up for Garrett Cole, I think if you save $1,400, you can get somewhat similar upside in Sonny Gray. Then dropping down to Aaron Savali, 9,300. He feels a bit expensive here, but I love using right-handed pitching versus Detroit. In his first three starts so far this season, he's been excellent. 26 points, 22 points, and 20 points. Pitch count, again, not an issue, especially with the Cleveland pitching staff. They tend to go pretty deep into games. We've seen this pitch count from 100, 106, and 97. He's had 2 9-strikeout games with a 5-strikeout game, and overall, he's just been pretty darn good. He actually did really well versus Minnesota and Detroit. I mean, they're a really soft matchup for right-handed pitching. If you're looking at their numbers last season versus righties, I mean, you loved righties versus Detroit. 26.5% K rate, 73 WRC plus 283 WOBA. Obviously not the same exact number so far this season, but they still have struggled versus right-handed pitching, and I've definitely used quite a few righties versus them this year. So I like Aaron Savali quite a bit. 5 strikeouts in Vegas, less than 4 runs against him. He's fine. I think he's a fine option. And then we can drop down to Framber Valdez at 8,800, and he's also had a hot start to the season, especially in his last 2 outings. Now, his first outing versus the Dodgers did not go well, but you can't really expect someone to do that well versus the Dodgers. But last 2 starts, he went against the Angels and Oakland, and he scored 26 and 27 fantasy points. And also, he got up to over 100 pitches in his last start, which is really encouraging to see. He struck out 8 and 9 in his last 2 starts, and I think he's a fine option here going up against Seattle. I mean, they don't have the worst team in the world. We expected them to have the worst team in the world, but they've actually been hitting pretty well. But they do strike out quite a bit versus righties and lefties. If you're looking at their splits last season, they had a 25.7% K rate last year versus them. Did have some power, but overall, it's not that great of a lineup. And only 3.77 runs against him, 5.5 strikeouts in Vegas. He's pitching at home. Now, his numbers last year weren't great. 4.31 xFIP with only a 21% K rate and a 13% walk rate, but a very high ground ball rate at 62% and only a 16% fly ball rate. So should be able to keep the ball on the ground here. Hopefully rack up some strikeouts, and I think he's a fine option. He's also one of the biggest favorites in Vegas at a 65% chance for a win. So don't mind Valdez. But Frankie Montas, 8,400, I could see him ending up being pretty popular. Let's say the Giants are just a really soft matchup overall for any pitcher. And I believe he has the lowest implied team total against him currently. Cole's implied team total out yet for Boston is not out yet, but I'd have to imagine it's going to be pretty low. But only 3.39 runs against him, 64% chance for the win, and 6 strikeouts in Vegas. And he's just a pretty good pitcher, and he's another guy that's had a pretty good start to the season. Last couple of starts, he's been dominant. He scored 31 and 28 fantasy points versus Seattle and versus Houston. Houston's not an easy matchup, so respect to that outing. He's went 7 innings the past 2 games, 99 pitches and 86 pitches, and he's just got some decent stuff. He has strikeout upside at 26%, limits the walks at 6%, limits the hard contact, only 0.75 home runs per 9 innings. In the matchup versus the Giants, they don't strike out a ton, but it's just a really soft spot for him. We just saw Greinke and Lance McCullers recently do very well versus them, and I think Montas can have a similar outing here. And he's in a pitcher's park in San Francisco, so I guess Oakland's a pitcher's park too, but San Francisco is definitely a pitcher's park, and I think he's a fine option at 8,400. If you want to go double mid-range today, I have no problem with that because I'm not sure if I really want to spend like $20,000 per pitching today because there's a lot of good batting options. So if you want to stick with the Savali, Montas, even though Savali's not really that mid-range, so I guess more like Montas and Brandon Woodruff, I think that can end up being a pretty popular pairing. I have no problem with that whatsoever because I don't really want to break the bank on pitching today. If you find enough value where you can fit in Cole and one of these guys like Montas, Woodruff, or Valdez, go for it. But it's gonna hurt. It's gonna hurt the salary a little bit, so just keep that in mind. But dropping down to Brandon Woodruff at 8,200, I've actually been using him quite a bit this season. I think the guy's got a lot of talent. He's obviously got a good strikeout rate. But really, outside of one start this season, he's kind of just been average. 13 points his first outing, but then 37 versus Pittsburgh. I feel like that's what I'm just kind of chasing at this point. But 16 points, then 12 points. So he hasn't been like amazing, but he's been fine. He's got strikeout upside. And the thing is, with Chicago, the wind is blowing in today, which it's not blowing in like 20 miles per hour, but I think it's around 8 to 10 miles per hour, which at a wind-sensitive Wrigley Field, that does boost you a little bit. And Woodruff's a fine pitcher. And the Cubs, I mean, they have some decent bats in the lineup for sure. I mean, they got a solid offense. You got Kyle Schwarber, Chris Bryant, Javi Baez, Wilson Contreras. But I do like this spot for Brandon Woodruff here with the wind blowing in. A 3.36 xFIP last season, only 6% walk rate, 29% K rate. Limits to hard contact, only 36%. And look, I don't love picking on the Cubs, but with the wind blowing in, I think it's a decent boost. And I like the price tag here. I think he can rack up the strikeouts for sure. So I don't mind Brandon Woodruff. And if you want to go all the way down, I wouldn't hate punting with Kyle Wright. Now, he's not a good pitcher. If you're looking at his numbers, I mean, they're bad. I mean, he had 9 ERA last season, a 5.44 xFIP, 19% K rate, a 14% walk rate, and nearly 2 home runs per 9 innings. The only reason I have him here is because he's going up against Miami, which on paper is a pretty good matchup. Now, I know they have been has had some decent games so far this season, kind of just like the Orioles. But on paper, they have bad lineups. But they have been able to show some upside this season. But Kyle Wright, he's dirt cheap. He's only on here if you need some Coors bats because he's going up against Miami. If he just slides by with 10 to 12 points, you'll be happy with it. Now this season, he's scored -2, 12, and 6. So we'll see how it goes. Pitch count, he threw 91 pitches in his last game, so he's okay. If he can get by with 2 to 3 runs and he just survives and maybe picks up a win, I think he's a okay option, but I would not use him in cash games because I just feel like there's definitely blow-up potential there with Kyle Wright because he is just not that good of a pitcher. Sorry, my email's going off. I paused that, or I silenced that. But I think we can move on to the bats at this point. I'm more of a fan of the mid-range there. I'm not sure if I'm going to spend up for Garrett Cole on this slate, but if I had the money, I would like to, but I feel like I'm going to end up in that mid-range just to save some money and hopefully load up some bats. So we'll move on to the bats now, and we'll start with Mitch Garver. He comes in at 5,100, and I do like the Twins quite a bit on this slate. I think they're one of the better stacks. Vegas would agree. They're at 5.31 runs in Vegas, which I believe is top 5 on the slate. Going up against Jacob Junis, who does give up power to both sides of the plate. He does not have that high of a strikeout rate. Typically throws a lot of strikes, and he does give up quite a bit of power, and actually more power versus right-handed bats last season, 210 ISO compared to 177 to lefties, but both sides of the plate are in play here for sure. And Mitch Garver, while he hasn't had the best start to the season, he still crushes lefties and righties, and I like the Twins quite a bit. So if you're spending up a catcher, I don't mind Mitch Garver, but I'm really probably just going to end up punting with Sandy Leon just to save me some money, but I don't mind Mitch Garver if you're spending up. Then Robinson Chirinos, he is just going to be in Coors Field, so that's obviously going to put him in play. And I prefer the Rangers side of the ball, like in football. I prefer the Rangers side over the Rocky side in this slate because Lance Lynn is obviously a really good pitcher. So not really looking to use too many Rockies versus Lance Lynn. I mean, they're playable if they can get to him and get to the bullpen. But overall, I'm just really not on the Rockies as much. But definitely like the Rangers going up against Ryan Castellani. I think that's how you say his name. He's only made one start so far and didn't go that great. I mean, he scored 10 points, but I think he gave up 4 runs versus Seattle. But I think the Rangers here should be able to tee off for the most part. And they have the highest team total on the slate at 6.22. And Chirinos, he's a guy that strikes out a ton, but he does have power to both sides of the plate. So Coors Field, he's playable. But I think what everyone's going to probably do is just punt with Sandy Leon here. I mean, he's going to be hitting lower in the order. He's not a great hitter, but he's 2,000. He's free, and the Indians are one of the better stacks on the slate, in my opinion. They have a team total of over 5, and Sandy Leon is just, he's the bare minimum. You can just throw him in there, and then it really opens up your lineup. You might be able to get you Cole in your lineup, too, if you really want to spend up for pitching. So don't mind Sandy Leon. Obviously, the splits are going to suck, but this is mostly just getting a free bet on one of my favorite stacks on the entire slate. Ivan Nova is a very low strikeout pitcher. I prefer lefties versus him, but righties are in play as well. But high ground ball pitcher to righties, but still like Sandy Leon quite a bit. Then dropping down to first base, we have Luke Voit, 4,500, going up against Colton Brewer. So he's not the projected opener. That would be Ryan Brazier, but the long reliever is projected to be Colton Brewer. Now, I mean, it's just the Boston pitching staff for the most part. I think there's no team total out yet for the Yankees, but I have to imagine it's going to be one of the highest on the slate because the Boston's just been a dumpster fire this season. I mean, their pitching is absolutely horrendous. I think, what did the Rays score last night? Like 16, 17, 18 runs. I mean, they just absolutely teed off versus, what was it, Kyle Hart? Feel bad for the kid, but he just absolutely destroyed. I mean, the Yankees have one of the best lineups in the league. I mean, I don't have Judge or all those guys listed here, but they're playable just because, but he's just really expensive at 6,200. But I don't mind the cheaper option. Like Boy here, 4,500. He's got more power to right-handed pitching, and that's what Brazier and both Colton. I keep wanting to say Colton Burns. Colton Brewer is, but I mean he's fine. If you just want to stack up the Yankees, he's in the mid-range, and I think he's okay. Joey Votto, 4,400, going against Chad Kuhl, who really does struggle with lefties. If you're looking at his splits last season, there isn't any because he didn't pitch, but I still think he is a fine option. I do like the Cincinnati lefties here, and they have a team total of around 5, which I could see. It's at 4.96 right now, but I could see that creeping above 5 as the day goes on. We're also in a nice hitters park in Cincinnati and Great American Ballpark, and Kuhl does struggle with lefties, and there's a couple of good lefties that are pretty cheap in this lineup that I definitely think are playable and stackable on this slate. And if you're looking at Votto's numbers, they're not great, but 18% K rate, 12% walk rate, 185 bias to the righties. He's a fine option if you're using some Cincinnati bats. But one of my more favorite plays, I think it's going to be Carlos Santana. He comes in at 4,300. I do like the Indians quite a bit. Now, I know I'm an Indians fan, so I might sound biased, but they are in a pretty good spot. Now, Detroit's not the best hitters park in the world, but not something I'd really just end up fading. And Ivan Nova does struggle with lefties, and we're going to have quite a few switch hitters in this lineup, so they're going to have the advantage here versus Nova. And if you're looking at Santana's splits versus righties last season, he had a 237 ISO, 381 on base percentage, and a 126 WRC plus. And if you're looking at Nova splits versus left-handed bats, only a 14% K rate and over a 200 ISO. So all these left-handed bats on the Indians do grade out some pretty good options on this slate. Dropping down to second base, we have Rougned Odor at 5,100. Look, if you're on the Rangers, you're a good play, but for the most part, these guys are pretty expensive, so I don't think they're must-plays on this slate. But Odor's definitely got some high home run probability here, and the guy he can crush baseballs for sure, but he does strike out a lot, which does make him risky. But we're in Coors Field. Ryan Castellani does not scare me whatsoever. 30% K rate last season, right-handed pitching. Like, that's what I said. I mean, Odor does strike out quite a bit, but there's power upside too. 227 ISO. But, man, these numbers are just pretty poor overall. So it's really all or nothing for Odor, but I don't mind him in tournaments. I wouldn't get there in cash games just because he's over 5,000, and I don't really like that price tag at all. The Nick Salak here at 4,700. If you're looking at splits, he's much better versus lefties compared to righties. He had a 340 ISO to lefties last season compared to 101, but it's pretty much just targeting Coors Field here. He's a little bit less expensive. He's also eligible in the outfield, so I don't mind Salak. He's going to be hitting higher in the order as well. But Cesar Hernandez, 4,100. I could see myself just ending up going here. I like the Indians on this slate. He's pretty cheap at 4,100. Going to be leading off. He's got better splits versus right-handed pitching, and Nova does struggle with lefties. And we got plenty of switch hitters in this lineup. So the Indians do grade out pretty well, and also the Detroit bullpen's not that great either. So I do think they can do some damage on this slate. And there's some affordable bats. There's also some expensive bats, but for the most part, they're not that expensive. Besides Jose Ramirez and Francisco Lindor. But Cesar, he's got better splits versus righties, 152 ISO compared to a .07 ISO to lefties, and just overall better numbers, only a 16% K rate and a 286 batting average. So I do like Cesar Hernandez. If you're stacking up the Twins, Luis Arias, either way, 3,600. I think he's a fine option versus Jacob Junis. He's actually got some pretty good splits versus right-handed pitching. Not a ton of power, but a near 400 on base percentage, a 136 WRC plus, a 355 batting average, and only a 7% K rate. I like using some of these Twins versus not Lance Lynn versus Jacob Junis. So I think they're totally in play, and they're one of the better stacks on this slate. And then Josh Van Meter, 3,000 if you're looking to punt at second base. Well, I guess not punt, but looking for a value option. You have Josh Van Meter versus the righty and Chad Kuhl. If you're looking at his splits, he's not very good at all versus lefties, but versus righties, he's got some decent splits here. 181 ISO, 98 WRC plus, a 250 batting average. Not great, but he's definitely got some pop versus righties. And this is a great park for lefty power, so I don't mind Josh Van Meter. Dropping out of third base, we have some two heavy hitters in Nolan Arenado and Jose Ramirez. So Arenado, he's in a tough spot versus Lance Lynn. Lance Lynn is a great pitcher. He's got a 35% K rate to righties, and only a 4% walk rate. He does give it more power to them though, 175 ISO. So I think there's at least some home run probability here. But I don't love picking on Lance Lynn. But it is Coors Field, so you get neutralized a little bit. But if you're spending up for Arenado, I don't hate it. He's good versus lefties and righties. Prefer him versus lefties, but still elite numbers overall. Only 13% K rate. 315 batting average and a 258 ISO. But the matchup versus Lance Lynn is scary. So he's obviously a must on this slate. There's some slates where you got to play Arenado and you got to play Story. I mean, you just got to. They're going to be 50+% owned. I don't think that's the case on this slate. There are only GPP options for me on this one. And the Rockies don't even have a team total above 6, which is not something we usually see in Coors Field. So I don't think they're a must on this slate by any means. Neither are the Rangers. But Jose Ramirez, 5,600. If you're not going to spend up all the way for Arenado, I don't mind Ramirez at all. I actually kind of like Ramirez a little bit better because he draws a much softer matchup versus Ivan Nova, who does struggle with left-handed bats. And if you're looking at Ramirez's splits versus righties last season, he's got a 239 ISO, 16% carry. He's a high contact hitter, double-digit walk rate, and just overall pretty solid numbers. Not the highest batting average in the world, but I mean, J-Ram, he's one of the top hitters in the league, and the guy can definitely go on hot streaks. And I don't mind Ramirez here, double dong opportunity pretty much every single time he goes up because there's some slates, man. We'll see Jose Ramirez just get those double dong performances. Now, Ramirez is a streaky guy, like I said. There's some times where he can go 0 for 20, but then there's some times where he's the best player in baseball, and he's just hitting home runs each and every single day. But I do like the Indians quite a bit here versus Ivan Nova. Not a scary pitcher by any means, a low strikeout guy, and just prefer lefties versus him as well. But you can use righties as well. Then dropping down to Marwin Gonzalez at 3,800. He's just a cheap part of that Minnesota Twins stack. He should be hitting near the middle of the order. Prefer him versus left-handed pitching where he's got a 300 batting average versus them last season, but he's still fine. The numbers are pretty weak versus righties, less than a 250 batting average, only a 144 ISO, but It's just if you want a cheap Twins, I don't mind him whatsoever. Then dropping down to shortstop, Trevor Story, pretty much the same exact reasons as Nolan Arenado. He's not a must on this slate, and actually kind of like the Indians guy better. That's right below him. Prefer Ramirez over Arenado. I prefer Francisco Lindor over Story. But it is Coors Field, and Lance Lynn does give more power to righties, and Trevor Story was really good versus right-handed pitching last season, so he's fine, but he's also super expensive. He's going against a really good pitcher, so I don't think he's a must on this slate. But if you're in tournaments and you want to get lower ownership on a Coors Field bet, Story and Arenado should be somewhat low owned, so I think they are fine options. But I do like Frankie Lindor quite a bit here. 5,200 going against Ivan Nova. I like the Indians quite a bit. I've already said it so many times by now, but they have a team total of over 5. Detroit bullpen's not that great, and look, you get a $1,000 discount off of Trevor Story. I think we have similar upside here. If you're looking at Lindor splits versus right-handed pitching, 263 ISO, 580 slugging, and your 300 batting average, only a 15% K rate. And like I said, Nova, low strikeout guy, and does have over a 200 ISO versus left-handed bats. So I like Lindor quite a bit there. Then Jorge Polanco, only 4,200. He might be the best cash game option because of the price tag, but because, Lindor at 5,200 might be pretty hard to fit in, but I like Jorge Polanco a lot at 4,200. I like the Twins quite a bit. 5.31 implied team total, which is one of the higher totals on the entire slate. Jacob Junis is not a great pitcher. He only has around 20% K rate and gives up high ISO to both sides of the plate. Gives up more power to righties, but left side's nothing to be scared about. 177 ISO is still pretty good. That's last season. But I like Jorge Polanco, only 4,200. He's a high contact hitter. He's much better versus right-handed pitching with over a 200 ISO, 133 WRC plus, 14% K rate, and over a 300 batting average. So Jorge Polanco checks in as a pretty good option on this slate, in my opinion. Then we have Mike Freeman, 2,400. This is if you just need a punt option. He's also eligible at second base. But I like the lefties here versus Ivan Nova, and I really just like the entire Indians lineup for the most part. And he should be hitting towards the middle to the back end of the lineup. But if you're looking at splits versus right-handed pitching, they're not great last season. Less than a 100 ISO, 264 batting average, 26% K rate. But he's just a cheap option that is viable on this slate. So I don't hate it only because he's this cheap. And there's just not that many cheap options that I like at shortstop. You could also look at Freddie Galvis, but I'm not trying to list the entire slate here because I already had like over 30 players listed. And I don't want to go too deep. But I like Cincinnati lefties, so you could look at him as well. Then dropping down to the outfield is absolutely loaded as usual. So we'll start with Charlie Blackmon, 6,000. Look, I like the Rockies, but they're just super expensive. They're going up against a good pitcher, so I don't think they're a must on the slate. But Charlie Blackmon's been one of the hottest players in the entire league. I believe he has over like a 500 batting average right now, which is just insane. So anytime Blackmon's going up against a righty in Coors Field, he's going to be playable. But 6,000 versus Lance Lynn, it's tough. He does give up less power to lefties as well. But if they can get to the bullpen early enough, they should be able to do some damage. But I just don't love the matchup versus Lance Lynn. But I can't leave Charlie Blackmon off the player pool going up against a righty in Coors Field. But I'd rather play Joey Gallo. He's 5,400. He's got some of the best power in the entire league versus lefties and righties. And there's a decent chance we can see a Gallo bomb versus Ryan Castellani, in my opinion. The Rangers had the highest team total on the entire slate. They're in a great hitter's park in Coors Field, obviously. And look, Gallo crushes lefties. He crushes righties. Now, he strikes out a ton, but if you're looking at his numbers versus righties last season, a 313 ISO, 38% K rate, which sucks. But you guys know the upside with Gallo. He can always double and triple dong, especially in Coors Field. So do like Joey Gallo a lot. It's just a matter if you have enough salary to fit him in. If you're going to pivot off of Gallo, you can go with Nelson Cruz at 5,300, going up against Jacob Junis at home in Minnesota. And like I said, Jacob Junis does get more power to right-handed bats, and there's not many better right-handed power bats in the league than Nelson Cruz. I mean, Mike Trout, obviously, and I'm not sure if a couple of guys, Aaron Judge, Giancarlo Stanton, but Nelson Cruz, he's right up there with him. He crushes lefties and righties, 283 ISO to righties, 590 slugging, over a 300 batting average. Junis gives out more power to right-handed bats. So, like Nelson Cruz a lot. I also like that twin stack a lot. So, he's definitely viable. Now, I'd pretty much only play him if I'm stacking out the Twins because he just hasn't. He's probably not a guy I'm going to throw in as a one-off at 5,300. I'd rather just get the Gallon Coors Field, but Nelson Cruz is obviously a fine option. Shin-Soo Choo, 4,700. I think he's going to end up being really chalky, and I definitely like some Shin-Soo Choo leading off in Coors Field below 5K. Going up against Ryan Castellani, the righty, and we can certainly use Shin-Soo Choo here. He's got some decent splits versus right-handed pitching. 280 batting average, near 400 on base percentage, and over a 200 ISO. I mean, in cash games, you're probably just plugging in Shin-Soo Choo just because he's leading off in Coors Field. They're the highest team total on the slate, and he's definitely going to grade out as one of the better options on today's slate. Then Max Kepler, 4,600. Anytime he's going up against a righty, even lefties, but anytime he's going up against a righty, he's going to be a pretty good play, especially if he's priced in this mid-range in the 4K range. And you got to like Max Kepler here, going to be leading off. And Jacob Junis, he's a guy that definitely struggles with power. And Max Kepler crushes right-handed pitching, looking at his splits. And your 300 ISO versus them last season, over a 500 slugging, and just good numbers all around. So you guys get the idea. I like the Twins quite a bit. I like the Rangers a lot. I like the Indians, and I do like some of these Reds lefties. So that's kind of what I'm targeting on this slate. But yeah, I do like Max Kepler. Aaron Hicks. So I really haven't talked about many Yankees, only Luke Voit, but I do think they're stackable. I do think they're stackable on this slate versus Boston because they've been so awful in the pitching department this season. But Judge is super expensive and Torres is expensive, so I feel like at that point I'd rather just play the Indians and Rangers and whatnot. But they're definitely stackable. I would not leave them off your short list. But I like Aaron Hicks here at 4,500. He's a much better hitter versus right-handed pitching. If you're looking at his splits, pretty rough versus lefties, but versus righties, he had a 261 ISO last season compared to 114 to lefties, and overall decent numbers. Low batting average, 216 batting or 218 batting average, and a 28% K rate. But I like the power upside here, and the Yankees should have one of the higher team totals on this slate. Eddie Rosario is pretty much the same play as Max Kepler, so I don't really need to go too in depth there. Like pretty much similar numbers overall. They're both high contact hitters, and they're both very good versus right-handed pitching. So Eddie Rosario and Max Kepler, they're kind of just two peas in a pod there. And then Franmil Reyes, 4,200. I prefer the lefties versus Ivan Nova, but Reyes is a guy that does crush right-handed pitching. If you're looking at his numbers last season, he had 271 ISO. Now, strikeout rate and batting average is pretty low and pretty high, 30% K rate and a 238 batting average. But if you're stacking the Indians, he's affordable, 4,200, and you can easily fit him in your outfield. But Willie Calhoun, I think he might end up being one of the highest owned bats on the entire slate. He's 4,200. He's in Coors Field. He's going to hit in the top 3, and it just makes a little bit too much sense here. If you're looking at his splits, I mean, pretty solid numbers overall versus right-handed pitching. He's got a 536 slugging, 290 batting average, only a 15% K rate, and the Rangers are the top stack on the slate. He's only 4,200. I think we're going to see Willie Calhoun be pretty high chalk, and I think you just kind of got to smash him in your, or not smash him in, but plug him into your cash lineup, probably along with Shin-Soo Choo. And you can also throw Joey Gallo in there as well. But Shin-Soo Choo and Willie Calhoun are probably going to end up being building blocks for cash games just because they're cheap Rangers bats. Then Michael Conforto and Brandon Nimmo. I mean, similar plays here. They're both pretty cheap. Going against Spencer Howard, the righty in Philly. No team total out yet, but I do think some of these, some of these Mets lefties are certainly playable. If you're looking at Conforto splits versus right-handed pitching, 280 ISO, 141 WRC plus, 544 slugging. He's definitely viable. Brandon Nimmo is actually better versus lefties compared to righties, which is somewhat surprising. 325 ISO, 375 batting average, but sample size versus lefties is a little bit smaller because he's not always in the top of the lineup or in the lineup versus left-handed pitching last season. But Nimmo's fine going against the righty. I think he's certainly viable at that price tag. I also just realized I went out of order. Jesse Winker should have been there over Brandon Nimmo. But some of these Cincinnati lefties are certainly viable. Same goes with Shogo Akiyama. Both are pretty cheap, and they definitely have some decent splits versus right-handed pitching. And Chad Kuhl is someone that does struggle with lefties, and we're in a nice hitter's park in Cincinnati that does favor left-handed power bats. So don't mind Jesse Winker and Shogo Akiyama if you're looking for Winker splits. 234 ISO versus righties, and just overall some decent numbers. So don't mind Winker or Shogo. And then AJ Pollock, 3,400. I have not talked about any Dodgers, but I do think some of these righties are playable, like Mookie Betts, Justin Turner, and AJ Pollock, and even Kike Hernandez and Chris Taylor. They are viable, and they're also pretty cheap. But I did single out Pollock here. If you're looking at his splits versus right-handed bats last season, they're not going to be on here because there is a error. Because AJ, from some sites, it has the dot, then J, then dot. DraftKings the dot, so I'd have to fix that. But just know that AJ Pollock does have some pretty decent splits versus left-handed pitching. And if you're looking at Sandoval's numbers, he's actually pretty good versus righties, which you could use the lefties in tournaments. I think that's not the worst idea in the world, but for the most part, I do prefer the righties here. But he does struggle quite a bit versus lefties. 333 ISO given up and a 19% K rate compared to 136 ISO to righties and a 26% K rate. But I still don't mind AJ Pollock here for the price. So I do think if you're stacking the Dodgers, you can still use the righties, but I think the lefties do make some interesting plays in tournaments because I think people will probably end up overlooking that. And Cody Bellinger's still got great splits versus lefties. And then you could also look like Corey Seager's way, and Jock Peterson probably shouldn't use versus lefty because he's absolute trash versus him, and I wouldn't imagine he'd make the lineup anyway. But I still don't mind AJ Pollock at that price tag. But I think that's pretty much it for the video, guys. There's a lot to talk about, a lot to sift through. So hopefully it was helpful. If it was, remember to leave a like. If you're new to the channel, make sure you hit that subscribe button. And yeah, that's pretty much it. Follow me on social media. Support me on Patreon. We'll have the NASCAR video out pretty soon. I got to eat some breakfast first, so I'll do that. Then I'll work on the NASCAR video. So check it out if you want. But that's pretty much going to be it. Hope you guys enjoy the start to your weekend.